But what I find, again, specific about Trump, and that's what worries me, is I cannot but call it self-consciously clownish character of his rules. Are we aware of the vulgarity of his speech? And that's not ordinary fascism, no. Fascist leaders would never speak like that.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Charles on Point. I'm Charles, and today we're looking at a debate that goes far beyond one simple question. Is Donald Trump a fascist, or has that label been stretched so far that it no longer means what it once did? In this exchange, philosopher Slavoj Žižek and Piers Morgan take very different approaches to that question, and things get especially interesting when the conversation turns to the difference between political rhetoric and actual political action. One side argues that the language and behavior matter because democratic erosion can happen gradually, while the other insists that Trump's actions simply don't meet the historical definition of fascism. But here's where I think this conversation gets really interesting. Both sides are actually challenging the way we talk about politics today. So watch the full exchange, because toward the end, I'll break down the bigger issue behind this debate and explain why this argument is about much more than just one political label. And before we get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it.
You know where I see...
But do we get into a slippery slope here, Slavoj? And I say this with great respect, but once you start sort of having all sorts of different versions of fascism, it's very easy to then call pretty much everyone a fascist that you don't like. And part of my argument about modern discourse, and in particular about Trump, actually, is that people say, oh, he's a fascist, he's a Nazi. And I'm like, a Nazi? No. Really? You know, you're comparing him to Adolf Hitler, who murdered 12 million people. There is no comparison to me. And what it does is it over-demonizes Trump in a way that probably helps him, actually. But it also dilutes the impact of real Nazis. And to me, real fascists like Mussolini and stuff in history, if you start parking people like Trump into the mix, because you've extended the range of fascists to all sorts of different categories, you can hook everybody in, and then it's kind of meaningless.
We agree more than it may appear here, because you know what I'm trying to do, and this many people will like, is not to demonize people like as fascists, but to water down and extend, dilute the notion of fascism. I think the true tragedy, again, is the wariness, inability of Western liberal democracies to effectively act and solve problems. If you want an example, I think we should talk about it. One, it's, you know, Salvador Bukele.
Yes.
In a very brutal way, he arrested tens of thousands and so on. We know what he did. But the effects were felt in 2 years. And now, in the last 3 elections, he won almost with communist numbers, you know, 80% and so on. That's, for me, the problem, that liberal democracy is losing its ability to act. It's clear even now, in the United States, Democrats are still in confusion. You have democratic socialists, which I think are really old-fashioned social democrats, still much less radical than, let's say, Swedish social democrats.
Would you categorize Mandani as one of those, the new mayor of New York?
I think that, first, I'm here absolutely pragmatic. I don't like these choices. Should we mobilize locally people in small cities? Should we wait for a big revolution or whatever? Let's do whatever is possible. But the reason I am tempted to call Trump a very specific kind of fascist, and I will immediately go into it in what specific sense. Namely, all the fascist leaders that you mentioned and others, they, of course, functioned in a different way. They were with this false dignity, untouchable, no criticism, and so on. While the way Trump acts, I like to characterize him in another way. You know, Trump likes to attack the left as multiculturalist, confused, historicist, self-contradictory. Sorry, but if there ever was a historicist relativist, it's Trump. And although I don't fully follow him, what I like about somebody like Bernie Sanders, with all my critique of him, is that Bernie, nonetheless, as a person, not private, but how he acts, isn't he a model of common, ordinary, decent guy who speaks calmly and so on and so on? That's what we need. I think that
But you said, so in 2016, you said that a Trump victory might be for the best in America.
Yeah.
Because it would disrupt the liberal center and force a radical reorganization of the left. I mean, I would argue that what it did was provoke this kind of crazy new far left, woke kind of left, which I've argued repeatedly actually became, in the way that they behaved and spoke, very like the fascists that they professed to hate most. In other words, they wanted to censor free speech, cancel and destroy people and imprison people that they didn't agree with. They would support ridiculous non-scientific things like transgender athletes in women's sport and so on. And in other words, once you start denying science and biology and censoring free speech and so on, actually, this is all very fascist if you start wanting a state to enforce all this, right?
I tend, again, to agree with you. I criticized from the very beginning wokeism, political correctness, whatever you call them, not because they are too radical, but I think this is a typical, for me, wokeism is one of the ways of how to talk a lot and pretending to change things without really changing society. What did this politically correct feminism effectively do to make women's lives better? Concrete problems, abortion rights, health care, and so on. So here we totally agree. But what I find, again, specific about Trump, and that's what worries me, is I cannot but call it self-consciously clownish character of his rules. Are we aware of the vulgarity of his speech? And that's not ordinary fascism, no. Fascist leaders would never speak like that. What I'm only saying, you know where I see fascism? I remember when Trump sent National Guard to California. And he was asked, but aren't you violating the law? You are only allowed to use the army against foreign enemies. And his answer was close to fascism. His answer was, but those we are fighting there, immigrants, big corporations which use immigrants, this is a foreign invasion. So
but Trump's argument, all right, Trump's argument, because I've heard him use this when he extrapolates it, is that he will push the existing law as far as he can to suit his purposes, as I think most presidents have done. He does it in a more open, rhetorically inflammatory manner. But if you actually study what he does, often he gets kickbacked by the courts, and he doesn't then try and usurp, from what I've seen, the court authority and just bypass it. Now, that would be fascism. And similarly, when he lost power in 2020, although we had the appalling scenes on January the 6th, ultimately Trump did leave the White House. I mean, he didn't try and just stay in the White House or stay in power. So, yes, it was appalling and reprehensible what happened that day, but a real fascist wouldn't have left, right? They wouldn't have accepted the result of an election at all, wouldn't have left the White House, would have carried on just running the country. So again, I'm just saying that Trump can often sound like he's a fascist. And I understand why people then assume that that's what he is. But in terms of his actual actions, until I see him literally usurping American law and just ignoring it and doing whatever he wants, I don't think he does that. I think he pushes the door as hard as he possibly can. But the judges and the courts, it's up to them. If they then, or the Supreme Court says you can't do something, I've not seen evidence he then just does it anyway, which is what a fascist would do.
again, the key is, I think, that you still use the term fascism in this violent sense. You break the law, or all the.
Well, ignoring the law and ignoring.
Well,
ignoring a democratic election, ignoring the law. All those things are the actions of a genuine fascist, I would say. Whereas I don't see that with Trump. I see a lot of inflammatory rhetoric, a lot of stuff which comes out of his mouth which sounds like it's fascist. But actually, if you study his actions, they're not the actions of a fascist.
Didn't he nonetheless come pretty close to it with the way he used that ICE and so on?
And this is where I think the debate becomes much more important than the argument over whether one specific word, fascist, is technically correct. Because if you listen closely, Piers Morgan and Slavoj Žižek are actually arguing about two completely different standards for judging political leaders. Piers is looking at actions and institutions. His argument is essentially, if the courts can still stop a president, if elections still happen, and if a president ultimately leaves office after losing, then we should be very careful before using a label as historically loaded as fascism. And honestly, I think that's a fair caution. Political language matters. If we start calling every politician we strongly disagree with a fascist, a Nazi, or a dictator, those words eventually lose their meaning. And once that happens, it becomes harder to recognize genuinely authoritarian movements when they actually appear. But guys, here's where Žižek's argument deserves serious attention. He isn't simply saying, Trump is exactly like Hitler. In fact, he goes out of his way to explain that he sees something different and more specific about Trump's style. His concern is about the way political language can gradually change what people consider normal. The insults, the constant attacks on institutions, the treatment of political opponents as enemies, and the idea that democratic rules should be pushed as far as possible. All of that can create a political environment where people become comfortable with behavior they once would have rejected. And that's the part I think both sides of this debate should take seriously. You don't have to believe Trump is a fascist to recognize that democratic institutions can be weakened without disappearing overnight. At the same time, you don't have to believe every criticism of Trump is valid simply because someone uses the word authoritarian. The real question should always be, what exactly did he do? What powers did he use? What institutions were affected? And what happened when those institutions pushed back? That is a much more productive conversation than simply throwing political labels at each other. I also found the discussion about the left particularly interesting. Piers argues that parts of the modern left have become intolerant of opposing views, while Žižek criticizes what he calls wokeism, for sometimes focusing more on language and cultural battles than on solving concrete problems. That's an important criticism because political movements can absolutely lose sight of their original goals when symbolic arguments become more important than results. But the same standard has to apply across the political spectrum. If we're going to criticize one side for censorship, political extremism, or attacking institutions, we have to be willing to examine those behaviors wherever they appear, including on our own side. And that's ultimately what I think this debate gets right. The danger in modern politics is that people are becoming more interested in defending their team than examining the facts. One side sees every criticism of Trump as an attack. The other side sometimes sees every Trump action as proof of the worst possible interpretation. Neither approach helps voters understand what's actually happening. So maybe the better question isn't simply, is Trump a fascist? Maybe the better question is, are democratic institutions strong enough to withstand any leader who pushes them to their limits? Because institutions should not depend on whether the person in power is a Democrat or a Republican. The same rules, the same standards, and the same principles should apply no matter who occupies the White House. And that's where I think this debate leaves us with something worth thinking about. We should be careful with political labels, but we should also be careful about ignoring warning signs simply because the most extreme historical comparison doesn't fit perfectly. What do you guys think? Is the word fascist being overused in political debates today? Or is Žižek right that we should be paying closer attention to the gradual normalization of authoritarian behavior? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Charles on Point, and share this video with someone who would enjoy this debate. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.